Auckland from House. And I have two of my friends here today, Representative Shannon Bird and Representative Mike Weissman. Shannon is JBC Vice Chair, and Mike is the sponsor of this bill today, so that has come into this proposition. So we're going to get going tonight. This is pretty complicated information, and that's why I want to do this. We have a slideshow that we're going to show you with some facts and everything on it. We'll have time for questions. Proposition HH will be on the ballot. So we did not to do this necessarily, but it will go up to the voters whether to carry forth with this or not. So nothing is set in stone yet, but these are the ideas for the ballot issue, the Proposition HH. So if you have questions for us, please put them in the Q&A part on the bottom of your screen, and we will be reading those off as they come up, and we'll kind of see what we can do with everybody. So Representative Weissman is going to start first, and welcome. We're really happy to have you here tonight. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Barbara. Appreciate your inviting me to be part of this discussion, and thank you everyone for your interest in a potentially wonky and complicated but important subject. So I'm going to share some slides here to sort of provide some context about how we got to where we are in passing what was called Senate Bill 303 and is now going before the voters of the whole state under the name of Proposition HH. Will be on this November's ballot. All right, let me get the screen share going. Okay. So because property tax is sort of dense, rather than jump right into the Proposition HH, I might just call it HH for short this evening, wanted to provide a little bit of context. So here we go with that. Kind of a roadmap of the next few dozen slides. I think folks come to this discussion with different degrees of familiarity, different backgrounds, so we'll sort of hit some basic overview. No legislation on any subject comes from anywhere, so we wanted to provide some of the history of what set us up for the discussion that we had in the legislative session that just ended several weeks ago. And then we'll sort of frame how we could engage in the challenge that people are facing, which is property values are going up a lot, and that drives up the tax bill. And then we'll go into HH in a little bit of detail. So just to say that we're not talking about a new subject here. This is a little screen capture from our statehood era state constitution. It's a tiny bit blurry, but at the top left, you'll see adopted in convention, March 1876. And then on the right, I won't bother reading all of it, but you'll see that in section 3 there, the original constitution of our state is talking about property taxes and even getting into some detail about how things go differently for mines and how mining properties were dealt with for property tax. That was an important part of our state's economy back then, as it continues to be, so they got some special consideration. Point is, this conversation in some sense is literally as old as we are as a state. Okay. So just a quick review, that number that you're responsible for paying to your county treasurer, where does it come from? It comes from basically doing some math. What is the value of your property? Probably talk most commonly about somebody's home tonight, but businesses pay property tax too. Basically the valuation, and that's largely about market forces. We're all seeing higher property tax bills around the state, largely because the Colorado real estate market is pretty hot. People want to move here, people want to live here, people want to buy property here, and it only gets built so fast, so that's driving up prices and valuations. Then we have something called the assessment ratio. This is essentially just a number, typically expressed to 2 decimal places, that says, all right, you're going to take your valuation, and then we're not going to tax you on 100% of that. We're going to tax some lesser amounts, and how we get from 100 to whatever we tax is the assessment ratio. And finally, the mill levy, or that's sort of detail speak for what we commonly think of as the tax. We pay a tax to our school district, to the county. Depending on exactly where you live, you might pay to one or more Title 32 districts that provide things like fire, ambulance, hospital, parks, amenities, libraries, any of a number of things. All of those local governments are allowed by law, if they get voter approval, to impose their own tax to pay for what they provide for people. Collectively, all of those are the mill levies. So it's by multiplying those three things together that determines how much property tax somebody owes. All right, so in the next couple of slides, I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail about each of those three elements that we just recapped on the prior slide. So the first one is valuation, and again, this is largely, the market in a down mode, and we all experience this if you've been around a while in the late aughts, even into the early tens, when the economy blew up because of mortgage-backed securities and things of that sort. All of our property values, well, maybe I shouldn't say all, but at least around Aurora, a lot of people's property values went down pretty sharply, and that was a very big challenge. We're certainly more used to property values going up in recent times, and again, up is what has driven the property taxes up. Okay, who determines it? We all elect a county assessor in our respective county, and these are folks who are responsible for applying the law and looking at all the property in the county and applying a fair valuation. This is very detailed, very fast. Not that anybody wants to get into all of it, but if you poke around at the Colorado Department of Local Affairs, that's DOLA there at the bottom, they have a collection of documents that are publicly available if anybody's really interested, called the Assessor's Reference Library Manuals. This goes into really the nitty-gritty of valuation, and if you add those up, it's very near to 2,000 pages. That's how technical this business of arriving at a fair valuation can be. And sorry, I just need to get the button to advance to the next slide. Zoom is trying to cover that up. Okay, now I'm not going to read all of this, but you'll see this is part of the text from the Colorado Constitution. There's some parameters, if you will, for how valuation goes actually in our foundational document, and exactly what this says has evolved a little bit since 1876, but the bedrock is still there. You'll see references to cost approach, market approach, income approach, and you'll see that there's references to agricultural lands being done a little bit differently. Not going to get too much into those different approaches this evening, but the point is there is law that the assessors have to apply. Your elected county assessor, doesn't matter of that person's party or background, is not allowed to just make up a number for what the property value is and thus what the tax bill is going to be. We have specific law that puts sideboards on that, including in the Constitution, also in the Colorado Revised Statutes. Okay, so the next major part of the tax bill is the assessment ratio, and this is something that not always, but only in the last couple of years, has been able to be adjusted by the legislature, and we'll get to that when we talk about HH. Folks who track details and have been around Colorado a while will remember what was commonly called the Gallagher Amendment. This had a nearly 40-year run in Colorado. We'll come more to that in just a slide or two. The Gallagher Amendment was part of our state constitution, and it really limited the legislature's ability to do much in the way of property taxes. And specifically, it was to minimize residential property taxes and shift more of that to other taxpayers if you own vacant land or business property specifically. That provided for a fixed assessment ratio of 29% for everything that was not residential. So other than the home that you live in, essentially. And the what's called the RAR, or residential assessment ratio, was dictated to float so that statewide 45% of all taxes would be paid by residential property owners, and the rest 55% by everybody else. So essentially, the residential assessment ratio had tended to go down over time. We actually had to lower it because the Constitution said so in 2017, which was the first year that Barbara and I were serving together. And then, it would have trended down even further. In 2020, on our ballot that year statewide, a bipartisan measure was put before the voters. It was called Amendment B. Gallagher, because it had proven to be pretty inflexible, was taken out of the state constitution. And that gave the General Assembly more flexibility to grapple with property tax details, critically including assessment ratios. So now if there's a bill, it has to pass both chambers in the same form and be signed by the governor like any other bill. The legislature has the ability to adjust assessment ratios. Okay, so the last part of the property tax bill then is the mill levy, or just the tax rate. And again, every local government that you live in, we're all in some county, we're all in some school district, depending on where you live. Your special districts could vary pretty widely. They all have to be responsible and responsive to their electorate. They have things that people want them to do: educate kids, pave roads that the county is responsible for, et cetera. And they need that level of service to be sufficient. But anybody in an elected capacity knows that people don't love paying taxes, and we all have limited ability to do that. So how the local mill levy is determined is just a function of that balance that your county commissioners, your school district directors, or your special district directors arrive at. Critical to note, the state does not determine how the local mill levy is set. So say the school district has a bond, and there's some mills or taxes to pay the bondholders who put up the money so a new school can be built or a school can be renovated or whatever. That's up to the local voters whether they approve it, and it's up to, in the first instance, the local government if that question goes before the voters. This is the part of the property tax formula that the state does not control. So we will move on from there. Okay, getting a little bit into the history now that sets us up for what is going to be called Proposition HH this year. We mentioned the Gallagher Amendment. This goes back quite a ways in Colorado, but it was a big change. It was in response to, at the time, there had been, a decade nearly of very high property tax growth. I mean, Colorado was growing quickly at that point. We gained a new congressional district, I believe, in 1980 to sort of reflect how much growth there had been. The judgment was that residential taxpayers should only be responsible for a certain amount, and then business would do the rest. And we alluded to that sort of turning of the gears in the formulas that happened pursuant to our state constitution to do that. An interesting quirk is that because the property market was relatively stable throughout most of the 2000s and the 2010s, the residential assessment ratio didn't change from 2003, I think it was, until 2017. And then staff in the Division of Property Taxation run the numbers as they're directed to by then Law Gallagher, and said, hey, you, the legislature, have to lower the residential assessment rate. So we did. It happened. It was the first time in nearly 15 years. Anyway, moving on. Again, if you've been around a bit, maybe you are able to benefit from it now. In 2000, again, there had been high property value growth and tax growth in the 1990s. In 2000, voters of the state put into our Constitution what we sometimes call the senior homestead exemption, which in summary means that you get to knock $100,000 off the taxable value of your home, provided that you're 65 plus and you've lived there as a homeowner for 10 years. Fast forward into recent times, we mentioned that Gallagher was repealed, and then in response to that, we've had some legislation in the last couple of years. Senate Bill 293 was a bipartisan measure that started to reduce assessment ratios in ways that we now could post Gallagher in 22. We did more of that. There was a bipartisan measure to further make some changes to work a $700 million reduction in property taxes that people would have paid but for that law. And I was one of the sponsors for 238. So that's 40 years of property tax law in history, very, very fast. To summarize that, my observation is that about every 20 years, we come to a place in our state, really because of growth, because people want to be here for obvious reasons, where the property tax bills that people experience start to grow quickly, and it generates a conversation at the legislature. We certainly know there are conversations, all over our state, chambers of commerce, other organizations. We most of us want what taxes pay for, but we don't love paying the tax bill. So it's how do you find that that balance. And again, the state's role in this, we mostly don't control how valuation goes. Again, that's market driven. We do now have the ability to adjust assessment ratios. And again, we don't control the local mill levies. If you think that the rate of tax that you're paying to your school district is too high, or to your county is too high, please go to your school district directors or your county commissioners in those cases. Okay, brings us to this year. What's going on? We all know this. We all got our property tax bill. Personally, I mean, I'm in a part of my city, Aurora, that has traditionally been more affordable. If you go back 15, 20 years, compared to the last valuation notice, you know, we probably saw a nearly 50% increase in the valuation of the home that I live in. Thus the tax bill goes up accordingly. You know, we all experience this as legislators too. And believe me, we all hear it from our constituents, regardless of our district and where we are. Now, on the one hand, you know, if we own something and it appreciates, okay, in the long term, that's good because at some point we might sell the home and there's a capital gain. But in the near term, we are responsible for the property tax bill, and that can be a challenge, particularly for seniors on fixed income, particularly because we've had inflation the last number of years. And you know, hopefully, as one works at one's job, you're rewarded with a better wage over time from your employer. But I think most people would say that their wages are not going up as quickly as some of the property tax bills have been. And again, this can impact small businesses too. A lot of the conversation has been about residential taxation, but small businesses pay property tax just as well, and we have tried to consider that in our legislation. So just to kind of frame the discussion a little bit more, here are sort of the two extremes, and we state them just to say we disagree with both of these. You know, we the legislature could have decided to not do anything, and this was not something we ever seriously considered. There is interest from members of both parties in all corners of the state to address the challenge that people are facing. The other extreme that we do need to reject, and we have seen things, you know, be proposed maybe as a statewide ballot measure, going back to last year or some floating around this year. There are other things, you know, that would be radical and I think not the right answer for our state, to make sweeping changes to decouple from sort of the market-driven nature of property taxes, to go back to putting language in our Constitution in a way that locks things in and limits future legislatures' ability to respond to problems that may arise in the future. You know, we all know that California has their approach at this. It leads to very significant inequities. Say Shannon and I might live in the same neighborhood. I've been there for 40 years. We have substantially the same kind of home. My property tax bill is very low because I've been there for a long time. Shannon buys the home from somebody who's moving for whatever reason. She owns the same home, pays a much higher property tax bill. You know, we're both getting the same services. Our kids go to the same schools. We drive on the same roads. We go to the same park on the weekend, but we're not paying anywhere near the same amount for that. We don't think that kind of approach is the right thing for Colorado. So we need to stay away from that too. As it usually goes with legislation, particularly on tough subjects, we need to balance two really important and somewhat competing things. We know that values are going up. The rates of increase are particularly high in certain counties, and we know that strains the household budget. Most people want to pay their fair share. That can only go so far, so we need to do something to help. And on the other hand, like we've been saying, we want our schools to be funded well enough to do a good job educating our kids because they're going to run the world someday. We want our teachers to be paid what they're worth so they can live in the communities that they teach in and pay rent or pay the mortgage. Counties have responsibilities from mental health care to keeping up roads to maintaining the county jail and the sheriff's department. And then again, depending on where you live, you might also have a district that runs your library or keeps up the parks and some trails or provides fire and emergency services. So with all of that, here is now sort of an overview of the legislation that we considered in the session, and that will take the form of Proposition HH that everybody gets to vote on this year. We are proposing a reduction in property taxes for 10 years. The brief mention before of last year's bill 238 was 2 years. Without going to the ballot, that's about all that we thought we could do. We want a more durable solution so that families can plan in terms of the household budget, so that businesses can plan to do something in a longer term way. We need to involve the voters with a statewide ballot question. So we're basically looking to adjust two of the three factors in the property tax equation, which again is valuation assessment ratio and mill levy, the two that we have any control over. And we're trying to do a few other things at the same time. So there will be some changes, reductions to assessment ratios for different types of property. On top of that, we will reduce the valuations a little bit. This is something that we are allowed to do to a degree. We want to give special consideration to somebody's primary home. Some folks are fortunate enough to own multiple properties. Maybe you have a vacation home somewhere. Maybe you rent one out. That's great, and those folks pay property tax bills too. But the policy choice that we made is that more people than not own one home, and we wanted to give heightened consideration to a place where you go to bed at night and raise your kids and live most of your life. So we'll come to that. Back to the senior homestead exemption. This helps several 100,000 people statewide. It does have this problem that it's not portable, and we can't change this easily because it's locked in the Constitution. This is getting closer to home for me because my parents who live out of state are in a situation, they had a certain home that they raised me and my brother in, 2 stories and so on. They don't need that much house for themselves now. Frankly, a 1-story house would be better for them. If you're grappling with that kind of question here in Colorado, you may have the problem that moving is going to cost you the senior homestead exemption, which can be $600, $700, $800 a year, real money in the annual budget, depending on where you live. We have sort of stepped around this problem. Again, we can't change that limitation per se because it's locked in our state constitution from 23 years ago, but we have come up with a way to provide something that's equally good in a way that we can do. And finally, we're talking mostly about homeowners here who pay property taxes directly. If you rent your home, you're effectively paying property tax indirectly because the landlord is going to pass it to you as part of rent. So we try to address that specifically. A couple of other things. We have a new concept in property tax law, which is kind of a limit of sorts in how much property tax collection at the local government level can go up in the future. We'll come more to that. And then because property taxes, even if we don't love paying them, they go to our local governments to pay for things that we do want. We want our schools to work. We want our county governments to work. We want a fire truck to roll out when there's an emergency call. We have a backfill mechanism from the state to fill in where revenue declines at the local government level due to the changes that we're making. So now we'll go through each of these in a little bit of detail. All right, assessment ratios. I'll have a couple more detailed slides in a few, but these are some of the major moves that we're making. HH, if approved by the voters, would reduce the single family residential rate even further than it was in last year's measure. Very small adjustments here, literally 0.1%. When you add up over millions of homes in Colorado, equal very, very big property tax reductions in aggregate for the people of our state. We will also be reducing commercial assessment ratios. That's business property on Main Street, for example. And we have something new called agriculture and renewable energy property. Some farmers may have agricultural land. They also want to generate revenue and contribute to our clean energy economy, say by putting up solar, putting up wind turbines. If you do both, you're going to have a new lower assessment ratio there because we as a state want to incentivize that. We know farm economics are tough. We want to continue taking steps in renewable energy. This is one way in which we can try to incentivize both of those at the same time. Okay. The next major component of HH is reductions in valuation. Again, this is mostly market driven, and there is language in our state constitution that requires, it's called the uniformity clause. There's good reasons for this, and go back to the Constitution. I mean, what you don't want, and you look back at some Supreme Court cases in the very early phases of our state, you find these things. You don't want people in power giving special favors to their friends when it comes to lowering their tax bill. So when we address valuation in the state statutes, we have to do so even-handedly, and that's what we're doing here. So on top of lowering assessment ratios, we are also providing for reductions in valuation by these set amounts, and these are basically all determined in terms of what the state budget can bear and the needs of funding for schools and so forth. And Rep. Byrd will come more to that when I finish here. Think of these two things as working together. We reduce people's property taxes by lowering the assessment ratio. We reduce it a little bit more by knocking a little bit off of the valuation. And really, this is to try to bring a little bit of what I would call a progressive or an equity way of doing this. Everybody gets this benefit, but just to use some simple examples, if your home is $500,000, harder and harder to find a house for that price tag in the state, but let's use that as an example. 50,000 would be 10%. If you were fortunate enough to live in a $5 million home, you still get the $50,000 reduction. It's just 1%. Compared to doing all of the property tax bill lowering just with the assessment ratio, this is a way to try to help out the majority of folks who are, middle income working folks a little bit more. And again, if you own the $5 million home, you still benefit from the reduction. Okay, moving now to some of what I'll call the new or special provisions. This starts in 2025 because we need to give our county assessors time to kind of get the architecture in place. We're going to introduce into state law this distinction of primary residence real property. So in the near term, just because it's going to take time to get all this going, and because we know that property taxes have gone up sharply and we're just trying to help people out that way. The near term, all residential properties will get those reductions that we alluded to. Going forward, it will continue until the end of the 10-year period for one's primary residence. And again, that's the only property that most of us own. If you own another property that maybe you rent out, or it's your vacation getaway spot, you'll still benefit from the reduced assessment ratio. You just won't get the extra benefit of this reduction in value. And there'll be a process whereby everybody kind of gets onto the list of primary residence property with your county assessor. So that's a new thing to further help out homeowners. Okay, senior homestead exemption portability. Again, for more than 20 years, if you're 65 plus, if you've owned your home for 10 years, you can fill out some forms with your county and you can reduce your tax bill. And we're not changing this. I want to be very clear. This is in the Constitution. It's going to stay in the Constitution, whether HH passes, whether HH fails. We needed to find a way to grapple with what happens if you move. People may have medical reasons, you have a hard time going up and down stairs, whatever. We commonly hear about elders wanting to downsize. So we're introducing a new idea called, it's a bit of a wonky term, sorry, qualified senior primary residence real property. And basically what this means is if you were getting the homestead benefit before and you need to move for whatever reason, you're still going to get the same benefit, just in a different way. On top of the $40,000 primary home benefit that everybody gets, you fill out some forms with your county, you'll knock another $100,000 off the amount that your home is valued at for taxation purposes. So again, if you're on the list for the constitutional senior homestead exemption, you're still on that list. We're not changing that. If you have to move now, instead of losing your benefit, you get basically mathematically the same benefit. It just happens in a different way. Okay, we talked about renters before. Again, renters are paying property taxes, and I think whether we're landlords or we're renters, or people are maybe both at different times in life, we all get this. It's part of the rent check that you send each month. So by bringing down valuation, or by bringing down the tax bill in all the ways we spoke about, valuation and ratio, we expect it will slow the rate of increase in rent that renters experience, because their landlords are benefiting from a lower tax bill, and there's enough units for rent that there'll be some market pressure to kind of keep everything close. In addition to that, we also have a provision, again, subject to voter approval. There will be $20 million annually to go to our Department of Local Affairs, and this is the part of state government that does most of our housing programs, to fortify existing programs to support renters. All right, I'm not going to spend too much time here, but we could maybe come back to it if it's relevant in questions. This is just a grid that shows all the different property classes and the changes that we're going to be making to value and assessment ratio. And it's pretty intricate, but the point is your legislators at the Capitol dug in and really tried to adjust details here to do something for almost everybody, regardless of the kind of property. Okay, another new concept. We're coming to the end here, and I'll turn the floor over to Rep. Byrd. So we've had this moment of high growth. Well, all right, what about going forward? I mean, what if things keep growing really quickly? Are we going to be kind of back where we've been? We introduced a new concept, which you could call a soft cap. Basically, going forward, again, subject to voter approval, some levies, the ones that haven't already been approved by voters, aren't going to be able to go up more than inflation, unless, and I'll hit the first bullet first, where the voters have already engaged, approved, say, a bond levy is a good example. You know, that's not implicated here because the bondholders need to get paid, and critically, the voters have already considered the question that was put before them and approved it. Certain other levies, like school district levies, are actually a state law matter, so those aren't implicated here. But the basic county levy is probably implicated, again, depending on your special district. Some of those levies might be subject to this. And the idea here is that, you know, if things are going up less than inflation, okay, you know, that's a manageable rate of increase. If the property tax collection would increase more than inflation, and we just mean the standard consumer price index inflation measure, then a local government needs to engage with its constituency. There needs to be a hearing, there needs to be public comment, and there needs to be a public recorded vote if the local government wants to retain revenue over what would otherwise be the inflation limit. It can do that, but the public gets to be involved. All right. Last major elements, and this is important, and this differentiates Prop HH from some other things that have been in the conversational space about property taxes. Backfill. Look, we are in a diverse state. We have fast growing areas, we have slower growing areas. We have areas with predominantly agricultural property that gets beneficial lower valuation, again, because we all appreciate that farm economics are tough and we all need to eat. Counties like that, where most of the property is agricultural, don't tend to have as much tax revenue because of how it's valued. You know, then you have counties like Denver County, Arapahoe County, lots of commercial property and more being added every year. That generates a lot of property tax. We have counties verging on 750,000 population, counties under 1,000. So on and so on. We've tried to grapple with all of this. Formulas are a little bit wonky, and I won't go into them in a ton of detail, but part of what is happening if the voters of the state approve HH, we hope that everyone does, we will set aside revenue every year to basically backfill the slower growing counties and districts, and via some amendments that we worked out, we are giving sort of heightened backfill consideration to some of the most key districts that are property tax dependent, fire, what are called health service districts, and ambulance districts. Basically people who are coming when we call 911, they've had some kind of unique price drivers even beyond inflation, and we need these services to be robust and timely, so they will get a little bit of extra backfill. After we take care of that, after we take care of renters, like we mentioned, we transfer money to the state education fund, which is a big part of how we fund our public schools in this state. And finally, to cover all of this, part of HH is asking voters to make a small adjustment to how we calculate the Tabor limit each year. Instead of population plus inflation, it would be population plus inflation plus 1%. that adjustment to the Tabor cap is how we make all of the rest of this balance out. Okay, lots more numbers and tables. Point here is on net, and the numbers just try to show that. These are the changes happening over time for an average homeowner. We sort of derived some values from the State Association of Realtors, the increase going from $503,000 for the house to $723,000. You can see what the tax bill was starting in 22, what it would be under current law for this year and next year, and then what the changes and savings are over time if voters choose to approve HH. Some different examples for seniors who get the benefit. And then again, on the bottom, we show what happens if somebody loses it. So the benefit is greater in that case if HH passes because we have the provision for portability. This is just using an example for an average commercial business that has a commercial type of property, restaurant, coffee shop, whatever, valued at an even $1 million. And this is what happens to their tax bill in response to the changes that are being made. Statewide, we have seen significant commercial growth. For the most part, they vary by county. Growth rate was a little bit less than residential growth, but still significant. So we're trying to address that as well. And then kind of putting that all together, reductions in property taxes versus small changes in the Tabor provision. We just got some updated economic forecasts, and Rep. Byrd on the JBC is all the way deep in this. We are looking at Tabor rebates in the next couple of years in the billions of dollars, according to forecasts from our Legislative Council staff economists. So the 1% change amounts to pretty small changes in what is otherwise returned via Tabor rebates. That makes possible very substantial reductions in property taxes with carefully calibrated backfill to local governments so that services can continue. On net, the savings to taxpayers is $1.5 billion over just 2 years. And remember, this is a 10-year proposal. Okay, I will stop there. I know that we're going to try to come to questions. I'm going to turn the PowerPoints off, and we'll give the mic over to my colleague, Representative Byrd.
Okay, and I just want to say thank you very much, Rep. Weissman. This is a lot to consume at once. So I will let you know that this is being recorded, and we will be posting the recording of that. So if you've been trying to take pictures of every slide and listen and take notes at the same time, you can kind of relax, and we will have all of these ready for you. Also, I will have Representative Byrd and Representative Weissman put their contact information in on the Q&A for you if you'd like to kind of get a hold of them and ask them a more detailed question later. And now we will go to Representative Byrd. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Representative McLaughlin, and thank you to everybody who took time to learn more about Proposition HH. I think that Representative Weissman did a really great comprehensive look at what's contained within the substance of the measure that we have referred to our voters this next election cycle. And it's important for each one of us to understand it and make good choices for ourselves. Whether you think the benefits are worth the costs. So I think it's important to note, I think Representative Weissman ended off talking about the change to Tabor, which would be involved with this, which is allowing us to change the Tabor refund and amount of state tax collections to population growth plus inflation, and now with this plus 1%. And that 1% is what allows the state government to be a participant in helping to fund county services that have been underfunded for decades, make sure that they have a backfill, but also put a cap on the increases in costs that we're all seeing because everybody seems to want to own property in the state of Colorado. As property values increase, we know that our costs increase because the value of our homes and our businesses are what is taxed. I wanted to just give you all a more global perspective on what Proposition HH could mean to our state if voters decide they want to approve this. For decades now, we have underfunded public schools. And one of the biggest pieces I think that I find most compelling about Proposition HH is that a portion of this revenue is dedicated to funding our public schools. I don't know about you, but I know about me and the voters I've spoken with across the state of Colorado. We have talked about wanting our state to invest more in public schools. Year over year, we know that we have a crisis in teacher compensation. And something that voters should know, one of the pieces of our state budget and our state financial situation that makes it very difficult to increase funding in a way that allows a meaningful increase in teacher compensation is the fact that year over year, our revenues into the state are very unstable. And it's difficult to commit to employees of any school district across our state a sustained ability to fund compensation increases. Prop HH, if passed, would allow for sustained revenue that is fairly guaranteed. Our state would then be able to enjoy, I guess we would say enjoy, I speak about this because these are all public services that we benefit from. When the state has a good economy, as we have for many years, the state would be able to share in that upside and be able to guarantee and appropriately compensate teachers. So that is something I find extremely compelling. Something else, and many of us really care about county services. This is also, government services are not free. And for years and years, we have underfunded county services. And anyone who is a champion of our counties know that the state for many years has not paid its fair share to support the cost of our jails, to support the cost of child welfare services, to support the cost of county road maintenance and other infrastructure projects. Proposition HH, while allowing our voters to keep the majority of their TABOR refunds, would also help fund county services. It's a trade-off. Granted, we understand that taxpayers would be giving up a portion of their TABOR refunds, but that's why this is coming to you. It's a choice for you to decide whether this is a trade-off that you think is right. I know I personally think that it's a good trade-off. That's why I thought it was a question worth merit for voters' consideration. Take a look at it and think about what this means to you. We have an opportunity to enable our state to grow as the state economy grows, to grow as our population grows, and make sure that we are sustainably funding services in a way that our voters and our taxpayers expect. I know that we want to reserve time for questions. We're at 6:46. I want to be respectful of everybody's time and definitely turn this over. But there are a few other points before actually I turn this over. I've seen some press recently that has talked about the Gallagher Amendment being something that was the repeal of which was a partisan repeal. And all voters should understand that placing the question of whether to repeal the Gallagher Amendment was a bipartisan decision. Both Democrats and Republicans voted to place that amendment question on our ballots. So there was nothing partisan about that. The way the Gallagher Amendment worked, and I think Representative Wiseman did a really nice job talking about this, but something I hope you all take home is we in our communities cannot survive as individual citizens in our homes if we don't also have a thriving business community. And that's whether we're in rural parts of the state or whether we are in big cities. We need businesses to thrive. And the Gallagher Amendment, in addition to freezing certain aspects or rather limiting what we paid as residents, it shifted the entire cost of local government to mostly our businesses with the ratios that were in place, making it nearly impossible for smaller businesses to operate. The Gallagher Amendment, for this reason, was particularly damaging to businesses in smaller communities because all of these values and the relative allocation of assessment ratios was based upon a statewide mathematical model, not necessarily what might be true in Durango or Brush, Colorado, relative to Denver or Boulder, right? I mean, understanding that the economies of each of these different communities can be very different, property values also very different, yet every city within our state was held, and county rather, was held to a similar relative allocation of assessment rates. So be mindful of this. We're trying to be thoughtful about the direction that our state moves forward. We want to definitely preserve support for local services, local government services that we all depend upon. And Proposition HH is an idea for your consideration. I hope you will give it a strong look. One other thought I'll leave you with is that never before was a Tabor refund ever guaranteed to any one of us. But if Prop HH is to be passed, every single one of us will be guaranteed a cut in our property tax increases that are now forecast to come about. So I offer that to your consideration. And of course, I'm happy to leave time for questions. Representative McLaughlin, you're muted.
Try not to talk when you were, and then I didn't talk at all. So thank you. Thank you very much, Representative Byrd. Those are, it's a good overview. Both of you kind of covered different parts of this, so I appreciate that. We have a couple questions up here in the next 15 minutes or so. I think this first one's kind of been answered, but why can't we adopt property tax based on the purchase price of a home? Mike, now you're muted.
Now I'm muted. It does work better with the mute button. You know, that's akin to, I won't say it's exactly the California approach. You know, I understand the appeal of it, but the problem is that over time you have different people who in a lot of respects are very, very similarly situated, live in the same part of town, own a very similar home, maybe earn about the same amount of money, paying very, very different amounts of property tax. Say, I'm just going to make up round numbers. You moved to Aurora 40 years ago, the economy was down, you bought a home for $100,000, your tax bill is accordingly. Since then, you know, our state's become more popular, there's been a boom in property values. Now the same home is $500,000. That example is actually not too far-fetched for my corner of the world. Somebody's going to be paying a whole lot more property tax, obviously, at the $500,000 valuation than $100,000. Although, again, same schools, same roads, same parks. To me, there's sort of a fundamental lack of fairness there, which is why we didn't think that that's the right approach to go with for our state. Okay,
thank you. Why was this bill brought forward? And Mike, this is probably for you, in the last 3 days of the legislature.
Yeah, so it wasn't quite 3. The bill was formally introduced a week out, and there were extensive conversations with leadership in both chambers, budget committee members in both chambers, outside interested parties, you know, business organizations, other organizations. You know, the property tax conversation has been going on, I mean, for years. In a way, it's never stopped since Gallagher, because it's a really, really big thing for our state. You know, rather than introduce something earlier that maybe wasn't as well baked, you know, you always have to try to find a point between not introducing so early that you don't have details right, and not introducing so late that there's not time for consideration. But ultimately, the bill went through committee, was debated extensively in committee in both chambers, was debated extensively on the floor in both chambers.
Representative McLaughlin, can I add to that?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I'm glad somebody asked that question. I think what's really important to note is that this is a question that is being put to the voters. This isn't a law that your legislators passed, which understandably would definitely require much more time and debate within the legislature. But you know what? We have 5 whole months, which actually is longer than the legislative session, for us all to debate the merits of this question. And every voter gets to decide whether the trade-offs that are posed by Proposition HH are worthy of your vote. So take advantage of the full 5 months. Ask questions, have thoughtful conversation with people you trust, seek unbiased sources of information. There are many media resources that are out there, also different tax policy analysts that are weighing in on this. I encourage everyone who's concerned about this and about their property taxes to be thoughtful, because that is what the Tabor Amendment asks of us. Isn't that right? That we are all now co-legislators in a way. We all help weigh in on tax policy for our state. So instead of Representative McLaughlin or Representative Wiseman or me setting tax policy, the requirements of our state constitution are such that we present these questions to our voters. So it's a very important question, one that I hope that each one of you will invest your time and take the 5 months to think about it and make sure you feel comfortable with your vote.
Thank you. I have a couple questions for you, Rep. Wiseman, about some of the details of the bill. One is that any growth, the bill states that if any growth is above 20%, there will be no backfill. Most areas grew by more than 20% this reassessment.
Yeah, so this goes to the backfill provision of HH. We sort of started the backfill conversation in last year's bill 238. That was a difficult choice that we had to make. I mean, again, the revenue coming into a local government that is funded heavily by property taxes is value times assessment ratio times the rate of tax, the mill levy. And in this case, in some cases, plus backfill provided by the state. There are areas that are a lot slower growing. They tend to be rural counties as opposed to metro ones. Year over year, there's going to be an analysis for each county, for each other district, Title 32 districts like fire, libraries, whatnot. Are they over or under 20? If under 20%, backfill. If they've grown more than 20%, the judgment is, they don't need backfill because they still have so much revenue coming in from that growth in value. Maybe they didn't grow 21%, maybe it was actually, 50, that times their tax rate ought to be enough to provide the services that they are pledged to provide to their local constituents. Because again, this is a bill about trying to reduce property tax bills that people are paying to the local governments and that businesses are paying, as Rep. Byrd also pointed out. And we did make a special provision again for those key districts that provide fire, health, and ambulance services. They will get backfill no matter how much they grow, in the amount of 50% of what they're not collecting because of the changes that are made if voters approve HH. The policy judgment is that those districts, because of what they do for us, are a little bit different. So the true statement of what that part of the bill does. And again, we're trying to balance what local governments need and the fact that people are asking us to cut their tax bill.
Okay,
And
thank you. Oh, yes,
if I
sure.
can add. So, and Representative Wiseman, as the prime sponsor of this bill, I wonder if you could talk about, though, those instances where if a local government believes that the amount it's allowed to retain isn't adequate, there is a valve for that, is there not, within Prop HH that you can speak to? And I think you touched on this in your original presentation.
Yeah, thank you. So the cap, if you will, the inflation cap is able to be exceeded by a vote of the governing board. Again, that's your school district. Bad example, that's your board of county commissioners or your Title 32 board. Let's just say a library district. Again, because dynamics in different parts of the state are different. I had a conversation with a colleague about last year's tax bill. She represents, not too dissimilarly from Rep. McLaughlin, a district with a lot of, you might call them resort communities, parts of the state that a lot of other people want to come to because they're awesome and you can ski and hike and things of this sort. Even where property taxes are growing very, very quickly, need might also be growing quickly too, to build out infrastructure, to adjust to rapid population influx, just economic changes, like ag land going out of production, turning into something else. This idea that the local governing board can vote to retain over inflation tax revenue, or can split the difference. You don't have to retain all of it. You could have a question that you engage your local constituents with and say, well, 50% is enough for us, and we won't collect the rest. That flexibility is there to be had in discussions around different parts of the state.
And I'll just add onto that, the state of Utah has a similar policy. And according to data and research that we have done, and speaking with colleagues of ours within Utah, approximately 75% of their local governments remained within the cap. So the cap that is proposed by Prop HH is very similar to what they have in Utah. And only 25% of the local governments have actually ever needed to exceed the cap. And I'm not sure, Representative Wiseman, if you mentioned this, but if the cap is to be exceeded, it can only be done 1 year at a time. If that local government indicates that it needs, to increase the cap in another year, they have to do the same thing, hold a public hearing, be accountable to their voters, because that's a local democracy. And then they can vote on that at that point. So definitely many checks and balances to enable local governments to receive the revenue that they need and remain accountable to their local voters.
Yes, critical point. Thank you, Rep. Byrd. It is a 1 year at a time analysis. It might be the local governing board might decide it's important to retain over inflation 1 year, maybe not the next year, maybe again the third year. Annually, sorry for sort of technical terminology, but it's called certifying the levy. That happens annually, and this process about maybe possibly exceeding the inflation limit sort of rides along with that. It is a once every year question.
Thank you. There's a couple I'm going to combine here for time purposes, and it's about how property taxes. Let's see. The first one is effective residential category for HH is owner occupied. I assume this would mean short-term rentals would not get the break, but it doesn't put them on the same footing as B&Bs, motels, and hotels at our commercial rates. How can you close that gap? And is that something that needs to be addressed? And then the other one is how this affects renters. It may slow rent increases, but that's not guaranteed. And renters are a lot of single parents, which is very true. And we still feel the much of the effects because rental properties are not getting the same tax breaks. So sorry, there's a lot of questions in there at once.
So Rep. Byrd, you and I have both worked on all of these issues. Do you want to start?
Actually, I was typing an answer to Mr. Horley's question, so I didn't hear the question. Forgive me.
Okay. I'll tell you what, I'll do my best, and you can fill in what I miss. So to the first part of that question, if you own a home and you short-term rental the whole thing out, then no, that's not owner occupied. You're not going to get that break. The question of how we deal with short-term rentals is an ongoing question, frankly, at the General Assembly, and it's so big that we knew we couldn't try to solve it entirely in the four corners of what is now Proposition HH, because this is already a big complex issue. A couple summers ago, I traveled down to Durango. I visited with Rep. McLaughlin at one of her favorite coffee shops. That same trip, I happened to pass through Telluride. I saw firsthand very, very powerfully the strain that short-term rentals can put on some of our resort communities. I know Telluride had some ballot questions that year about, I think one was maybe to adjust the cap and the local number of units that would even be allowed to operate that way. And there was another question as well. We have had some legislation at the state level to try to at least give counties the authority to grapple with these issues. A home rule city already has it, and counties, we needed to fill that in. I will just say, I think it's a key question. It is an ongoing question. It's one that I feel the weight of. It's not as much of an issue in a city like mine. Doesn't mean I don't realize that it's an issue around the state. I think you have a lot of legislators in both parties continuing to look at it. As to the question of, the way I think about it is, if it quacks like a duck, you have short-term rental property that's residential. It is operating in a lot of respects. If it's one of these things that's really full-time, rented out, arguably it's more like, a motel. Well, why are the two being taxed differently? It's a legitimate question. It's honestly one that we're continuing to grapple with. To part two of it for renters, we're not guaranteeing rent will go up by only a certain amount or will go down. That's beyond what HH can do. But we have grappled with other policies, and Rep. Byrd has really been a leader on one of the big ones this year. Going back a few years, we substantially increased the value of what's called the state earned income tax credit, which is a refundable tax credit. That means money comes back to you from the state for working folks, particularly with kids. For the first time, we funded the state child tax credit. Folks know about the federal child tax credit. That is what it is. Now we have a state one too. That is to support families bearing the cost of raising kids. This year, Rep. Byrd got a bill done to increase both of those, at least for 1 year. We also have a companion measure to HH that, at least for 1 year, will do what we call flatten the Tabor rebate. So again, even if people approve HH, we're still sending billions of dollars back. And the question then is how? Right now, we have a 25-year-old law that basically sends more Tabor rebate dollars to folks who are already doing quite well off. Flat rebate is simply that. You're a taxpayer, you get the same amount, period, done. We think that it's more fair. That will be several $100s to the good for particularly lower and middle income folks who we know are struggling, and we know a lot of folks in that situation are renters.
I'll just add on the short-term rental question to underscore some of what I think Representative Wiseman was alluding to. It's a challenging policy question. Housing markets in all parts of our state are very different. So what might be the case in Durango might be very different than what we are seeing up here in my district of Westminster. Also, you look at Aspen and Steamboat. Many of these communities have a lot of their housing stock swooped up by investors who engage in VRBO and Airbnb and rent those homes out. So much so that it is to the detriment of leaving any available housing stock for service workers or even teachers or firefighters, the people who are the most indispensable contributors to local economies. Whereas in Denver or Westminster, the impact of a VRBO or Airbnb is not nearly as impactful, which has made it very challenging. There have been many people who've advocated for single state solutions to address the challenges that they are seeing in their specific communities, but it doesn't make sense. When you have something that has such diverse impact, such as the short-term rental issue having such diverse impact throughout our communities, one solution is one that might work in one community, but have very many unintended consequences in other communities. So this has been something that the legislature has been grappling with. And I will just express a personal preference as we move forward that what we're doing is giving local communities the tools they need so that they can solve the problems that they are facing in concert with their own voters. And definitely making sure that they're honoring the preferences of what their own citizens want to see in their communities with respect to these types of housing arrangements.
Yeah, very difficult to have one law that affects everybody in Colorado equally, and we find that time and time again. And I think the good word of the day is grapple. We've grappled with a lot of stuff in here. We've all talked about, we grapple with a lot of this stuff that it's not one bill that's going to solve everything. So this is a very long question, so I'm going to narrow it down a bit. Lower property taxes sound great, but what about the impact of reduced tax revenues over 10 years? And the bottom of this says, let's see, could you go over the proposed numbers on state property Tabor numbers of state property tax savings versus state Tabor refunds? A 40 to 50 $1 million assessment savings doesn't sound like much at first glance.
I can take a first crack at this. One thing for you to understand is it's not exactly a tax cut, right? And I think that's something that many of the people who oppose Prop HH are upset about. And I think it's important for us to recognize it's not a cut in anybody's taxes. And that wouldn't make sense anyway. We have a strong economy, property values are increasing. But what we want responsible government, right? Government that remains affordable to us. It must be affordable, but also must be appropriately resourced to provide the services that we expect it to provide. What HH does is cuts the growth in what a no Gallagher environment presented to all of us with no caps, a wild west essentially of what can happen with increased demand for our property, increasing the values of our property, and thereby increasing the costs to every one of us. Prop HH would put controls on that so that you have a much more controlled environment. There would be limits on the amount of revenue that the government can collect on your property, and it would not be a Wild West. There is still growth that is allowed because we know that as more people move to our state, as inflation comes to us, also we have some remediation work to do. For many, many years, our state has not been able to benefit. And again, when I say the state, I mean all of us. I'm not just talking about an amorphous subject of government out there. I'm thinking about the services that we all depend upon. Those services have not been able to be funded at a rate that recognizes the growth in our local economies. And Prop HH, I believe, strikes that balance. And again, this is going to be something for every voter to determine for themselves, but it puts a limit on how much your property values can increase so that we are able to make sure government remains affordable to you, but that you also get appropriately funded local government services and public education for the first time in decades.
Okay. That was a lot. It was a big, it was good. You know, we're done. So I'm sorry, we have to kind of get going here tonight, and everybody had something else that they were off to be doing tonight. So I just want to say thank you very, very much. Again, this will be recorded and sent, and I'm sorry we didn't get all the questions answered. We tried to get most of them, but there's always more that come up, I'm afraid. So thank you very much, and reach out to us if you have further questions. And thank you all very much for joining us tonight. Thanks.